Old school drivers like me tend to stick with stuff we know is going to work for us. We're not the type to experiment with the brand new stuff that comes fresh out of the gate. Might look like a good idea at the time, but we like to hang back and wait a couple of years just to see how it's going to work out on the long haul. Generally, old school drivers are cautious because generally, as old school drivers, we tend to be a little bit cheap. As I say, with the new stuff, we like to hang back, wait a while, watch to see what happens. All the old school guys like me hung back when the new emissions engines came out. We didn't rush out and buy new trucks. We all stood back, waited to see how they would turn out. Now we're really glad we did. Something we always paid attention to was the type of oil we were using. When I started trucking in the 70s, what we were doing was, in the winter weather, we would use the 30 weight oil, and all we had back then was straight 30. There was no blended oils. So in the winter time, we'd use 30 weight oil and then switch to 50 weight oil in the summer because it was a nice thick heavy oil and it would hang up and stay tight on the motor when we were in the heat of the summer in July and August pulling the big hills. When the engines got really hot, that oil didn't thin out too badly. It stayed at the top of the motor and we could tell. But it was too thick for the wintertime up here in Canada, so we would switch back to the 30 weight oil because the 50 weight was just too thick. And the 30 weight oil even got to be thick when it got really, really cold out, and you had to be careful. And when it got really cold, we would have to warm our oil pans in the mornings. Before we fired the trucks, we'd build little fires underneath them, tarp them all up, let the heat rise onto the oil pan. Because if you crank the engines over, back then with the 30 weight, when it was too cold, when the pistons started churning up and down, the oil was too thick to rise to the top of the motor right away. So you would get metal on metal, and that would damage the engine. Later on, they came out with the first blended oils, and the first one I ever saw was 30W30, and that W stood for winter weight, and then later on they came out with the 1540. Now in 1984, I bought my first truck. I ran 15W40 Rotella in it. Right from the time I bought it, I ran that truck 9 years, over 1 million miles, and then sold it and had no trouble with it the whole time. So after that, I used 15W40 Rotella in all my trucks over the years. Now, when the T6 synthetic oil came out, back around 2012 I think it was, again, old school thinking, I hung back. I wanted to see how the stuff was going to work out. I talked to Shell, I talked to Caterpillar, I talked to old mechanics that I knew, I talked to all the drivers that were using it, and I did a few little backyard experiments of my own. Here's a couple of my backyard experiments right here. Let's see which one's thicker to the touch with the stick. Here's the 30 weight, here's the synthetic weight. Definitely tell the synthetic is thinner. Let's do the pour test. This is the old 30 weight oil. This is the new synthetic. This oil is at about minus 15 Fahrenheit, so we should be able to see the difference here. The synthetic pours much more easily. It's obviously thinner. Doing my little experiments, I could clearly tell when the oils got really cold which one had better viscosity, which one ran more smoothly and didn't tend to gel, and it was clearly the synthetic in the really cold weather that poured more easily. But what really convinced me was I got talking to an old boy that I knew that was hauling logs out of the bush, and he had switched to the synthetic, had synthetic in his truck. He said his truck would sit out in the bush sometimes in the middle of winter for 2 weeks at a time without starting or running, and then he would go out to it after a couple weeks, minus 15, minus 20 degree weather, and the truck would fire right up. And I think that was what finally convinced me to switch over. I did switch over. I put synthetic in this old girl behind me here, and she seems to run a little bit quieter and a little bit smoother. She obviously likes the synthetic, so I'm glad I switched. So it's nice to see that every once in a while, old school thinking can agree and get along with new technology. Stay safe, keep the rubber side down. We'll see you on the backhaul.